Before painting the hull, I need to complete the installation of some of the components that go underneath the ship. That is the rudder, the propeller shafts, and the skegs. All of these components will be painted in the same color as the hull. The only parts in this diagram that will not be painted in the hull color are the propellers. As such, I will not be installing the propellers at this time. I will install everything else in this step apart from the propellers. The components that I'll be using this build are all found on the D-sprue. When looking at parts 41 to 44, you can see some flashing on the inside of the sleeve for the propeller shaft. That's going to need to be removed. Also, while cutting them off, you can see that there are some pretty poor mold lines. The molding here is quite poor. There shouldn't be any markings like that on these parts, so those lines are going to have to be removed, and those are quite substantial defects. As for the rudder, it looks pretty good. The moldings are in good places, and I don't see much cleanup required for this apart from removing those injection points. After cutting the parts off the sprue and then remove the excess plastic around the injection point, I found the plastic here for these skegs to be quite thick. It seems unnecessarily thick, and the shape of it isn't very good. It makes it quite difficult to cut off smoothly. Ideally, you leave a little bit of plastic sticking out the top to file that down to get it flush with the intended surface. But when they make the plastic like this quite thick and tape it in towards the part, you have a tendency for the cutters to slip down towards the base and have it cut too close to the part itself, which can then pull plastic out and create a divot. I find this kind of design a bit frustrating and unnecessary. You can also quite clearly see now these mold lines and how poor they are. Those mold lines shouldn't be there at all, so it's going to require some fairly substantial sanding to remove them. After dealing with the skegs, I move on to the rudder. The mold line on the rudder is considerably better than the skegs. It is a slight line, but it's in an easy to access place and it is simple to remove. To remove the flashing from the inside of the sleeve for the propeller shaft, I use a round file. A few twists very easily removes that light flashing. This is certainly the least of the problem with these parts. This video is part of a build series on the HMS hood. If you are enjoying this video and would like to see other videos in this build series, then follow the link to the playlist in the cards above. If you have questions that you would like me to answer, then feel free to post them in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe to help the channel. After a lot of filing, I have these parts in a reasonable condition. I just want to finish them off with 400 grit sandpaper so that they are ready for painting. The propeller shafts are in much better condition than the skegs. There are some light molding lines down the length of the propeller shaft. That is to be expected, and it is easily removed with the file. Also, the injection points for the molding are much easier to deal with, and it's quite easy to cut off and sand those components flat. Now that all the components have been prepared, I can begin installation. Using a toothpick, I place a small drop of Revell Contactor Professional Cement in the hole in the hull for the rudder. That was a bit of a mouthful. Take a guess how many times it took me to get that sentence right. Anyways, I then place the rudder in the hole and position it straight. After the rudder, I install the propeller shafts on the starboard side of the ship. Once more, I place Revell Contactor Professional in the holes in the hull, and then place the component into the hole. After installing the components on the starboard side of the ship, I found that they weren't sitting quite how I wanted them to be, and that I needed to tape them down to keep them in the correct position. Although once taped down, I did find that their fit was very good. I often find that with propeller shafts and skegs on these ships, you need to do a lot of filling in the joint lines, but the fit on this ship is actually remarkably good, and that isn't required. So I decided that while the components are being held down with tape, I'd apply extra thin plastic cement to the edge to create a nice bond across the entire contact length of the components. After letting all of this glue dry for around a day, I then began installation on the port side of the ship. Installation on the port side of the ship was as I would have expected based on my experiences from the starboard side of the ship. The parts once again fit quite well. They did want to stand off the hull a little bit and required some force to hold them in place, but once again the end result was just as good and there's no need to do any additional filling of gaps. So after giving these parts a day to dry, the glue had set and the area could be sanded. To remove the excess glue, of which there is very little, I start with a 400 grit sandpaper. This very easily removes the very light extra thin plastic cement around the edges. After the 400 grit sandpaper, I move on to 1000 grit sandpaper to create a nice smooth finish that is ready for paint. And that is all for this video. In the next video, I will paint the hull. If you would like to support this channel or see how this model looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.